Hello? Do you hear me now? Does it work? Okay. Welcome back, everyone. There's a problem with the microphones. Yeah. That doesn't work, yeah. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to this plenary session on the WTO at 30, Revolution or Evolution. We just had a wonderful lecture and conversation about the state of international trade policy and globalization at the moment. And now this session will focus more on institutional issues. It is no understatement to say that the WTO is at a critical juncture. It is celebrating 30 years. It's about one generation. In 1994, 125 countries came together to sign the Marrakesh Agreement, which crowned 8 years of negotiations under the Uruguay round to expand the scope of what existed before since 1947, which most know as the GATT. There was an institution that was created, a secretariat, and very importantly, a dispute settlement system with a robust appellate body that many for a long time called the crown jewel of the WTO. Fast forward 30 years, the dispute settlement system is in crisis. Trade negotiations tend to stall, although there's been some achievements, such as a trade facilitation agreement a few years ago. And geopolitics, the return of very old-fashioned, very tough geopolitics, combined with the climate crisis, combined with other concerns about supply chain resilience that are ripping a little bit and tearing at the system. We have with us an eminent panel of experts from various backgrounds to discuss all these issues, to take stock a little bit of where the institution is now, 30 years on, and give us potentially some clues as to where and how we could move it forward for that, so that it stays relevant for the next generation, the next 30 years. So on my side here, right, we have Mari Pangestu, who for many people needs no introduction. Mari, you are, among others, affiliated with the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, but you are known also as a former managing director of the World Bank. And I know you as a student a lot, and young analyst, as a former trade minister, among others, trade minister of Indonesia. We also have with us, further to my right, Federico Banos-Lindner, who's a senior vice president at DP World, a UAE-based ports and logistics company who's really at the forefront of what's happening on the ground, whereas we discuss things here stratospherically. These people are, witnessing and living through everything that's going on. We have a few eminent academics with us. We have Rob House, who's a professor of international law at New York University, also known to many who have been in this profession for a longer time. A lot of writing about WTO laws, manuals, et cetera, and a lot of interesting recent think pieces about where to take the institutions. We also have with us Scott Lincicome, who is from the Cato Institute in Washington. You've been a long time a lawyer as well, and you currently work a lot, among others, on industrial policy issues, which we'll come back to. Last but not least, we are joined by Bright Okochu, who's Chief of Staff to the WTO Director General, and who will update us a little bit on where we are in all the conversations and where we might be going. So, let's start now the conversation. Mari, as a representative of a large developing country. The global south, or the developing countries as we know it, are the majority of the WTO's members. That's why I insist on having you telling us first. What has the WTO brought? You know, what have developing countries benefited from it? What's been the value of this organization for the majority of its members?
Thank you for that. Let me start just by continuing where the previous opening lecture ended in kind of the idea that, yes, everybody thinks or believes, at least developing countries, I think, have experienced the important role of trade for development, for growth, for poverty reduction, and so on. But I think the jury is still out there on whether or not you have equally distributed the benefits. And that is why you see the pushback in many developing countries. And this is something that I always say as a trade minister, I'm not a trade minister. Trade is a means to development. And you can't just rely on trade policies. You need complementary policies to enable the distribution of benefits. And I still think that's true. And this is maybe an area where we need more and better narrative, because certainly the politicians are always blaming trade. And by the way, I experienced this as a trade minister. Trade instruments are the easiest one for politicians to use. They say, okay, we're protecting you, we're increasing tariffs, we're doing this and that, because it's the easiest one to use. So just to put that on the table, that we need to really speak to the truth and find ways to really have the narrative for the politicians. Let me make 5 points on the WTO and the benefits I have seen for developing countries. And I speak from, I'm going to reveal my age. I'm going to speak from my 30 years experience. I was there from the beginning. And it is really about how the WTO in 1995, when it was created, became a platform for developing countries to participate in the global trading system. Finally, developing countries had a voice. During Uruguay round, they participated, but they weren't really participating. They were just accepting what was negotiated. And they were passive. So the first thing, the crown jewel that you mentioned, the dispute settlement was actually, I would say, for us as Indonesian experience and many other countries' experience, we can take on a major power if they were implementing unfair trade measures. We have had one win against the US on clove cigarettes, and it was basically violation of the basic principle of non-discrimination. We've also lost cases, but it actually disciplined some bad policies domestically, right? So I think the ability, this crown jewel needs to be appreciated and in moving forward to be continue to be protected or made to work better, especially since the last 5 years. We have seen unilateral measures on the rise and violation of the rules. Second, capacity building and training, how developing countries can better integrate in global trade. Third, I was at Seattle, riot police, curfew. You cannot imagine that happening in Seattle. And it was because the Quad, we call them the Quad, the developed countries were in the room determining the fate of the rest of the members. No wonder they protested, right? And post-Seattle, we saw a proactive response by developing countries. And I went through all this going into, Cancun failed, and then we had Doha, and then we went from Doha to Hong Kong, which was where developing countries actually not only found their voice, but also coalesced around groups. You had the G20 on agriculture, you had G33, which I led at the time as Indonesia, and least developed countries, and African group, and so on. Why were they important? Because we got together, we had invested resources, we had secretariats who would actually do the backup work to be able to justify why we want either special and differential treatment, why we want longer, why we want different outcomes, because we wanted to balance development. But we were not just saying no, we were saying no, not this way, no, we want longer, and we need capacity building. Fourth, why did Doha fail? After all that, we went through Hong Kong and so on and forth. Oh, the other thing is these groups also allowed us a seat at the table in the green room, because I was not coming in just as Indonesia, a large developing country. I was coming in also with all the 33, well, now it's 45 members of the G33. So it helps also to come to the so-called consensus that we needed. Fourth, why did Doha fail? We can go into a long discussion on that, but I think it was Doha, Hong Kong to Doha, from Hong Kong was successful, then from Hong Kong to Doha. There was a careful consensus balancing that went on. And it really kind of worked, in my view, having gone through it. But at the end, it was one or two members which didn't come to the consensus, which then, I would say two reasons. That's one. And second, political will was not strong enough. I was in the G20 meetings where I think it was perhaps Sarkozy who chaired the meeting. And the leaders all agreed the importance of completing Doha. And the ministers were all sent to Geneva. Said, okay, next week all the ministers go to Geneva and complete it. It did not happen, right? So it's something that we will continue to reflect on. But it is since then has, of course, made single undertaking no longer something that's possible at the moment. It went from no single, a single undertaking being still trying to happen, then it went to Doha Light, and we are now here where we are just working on different parts of the package, which is still a way forward. So the final thing I would say is that we have made progress, as the DG mentioned earlier, on whether it's the TFA or on the plurilaterals, as well as the fishery subsidies and so on. So I think we just need to continue to push the way forward in the way we can. And I think TFA is a success because it had the business support, and it also had developing countries which required capacity building also got what they wanted. It was one of the successful negotiations where you could craft the negotiating positions and the obligations with capacity building. And I think more of that needs to happen.
Interesting to have that sort of model in mind. But let's fast forward really to today. Scott, we are at a time of turbocharged industrial policy in the US and elsewhere. The China-US geopolitical rivalry, we don't see the end of it yet. What's the prospect for the WTO maintaining a system of fairly open trade? I mean,
yeah, I certainly agree with you that there are challenges in the U.S.-China relationship. Sorry. So I certainly agree with you that the U.S. and China and that geopolitical tension raises really a big challenge for the global economy. But I think the prospects are better than they're often described, including for the WTO. You start, I think, with some basic facts that, this declarations of deglobalization have really proven, I think, to be quite empty. If you look at global trade since the mid-2000s, goods trade adjusted for inflation is up almost 40% in global exports. Subtract China, it's up almost 30% over that same period. Commercial services exports are up from about 5% of GDP to 7% of GDP over that period. Digital trade, of course, has exploded, almost doubling over that period. So global trade has proven, even in this moment, to be quite resilient. In the United States even, the supposedly retrenching United States, it's actually a similar story. Inflation-adjusted goods imports in the United States are up almost 20% since 2015, since Donald Trump came on the scene. Much of that is occurring with non-FTA or preferential parties like Vietnam and India and others. Even the U.S.-China relationship, I think, is oftentimes oversold. China is still the United States' second largest goods import source. Still about 15% of all imports are coming from China and the United States. But even that, I think, is probably overtelling the story because there's been third country diversion and supply chains have adapted. So The rhetoric is quite bad in the United States on China, but the reality, I think, is again, not nearly as terrible as it might sound. Some of the worst legislation, most protectionist legislation, even in the midst of a presidential election campaign, has been shelved. For example, to end permanent normal trade relations with China. That was just put on the back burner by the House of Representatives. So even the rhetoric has been tamped down a bit. It's not that bad. So we have to ask, I think, why? Why have things proven well? And here, I think we start with the fact that we have decades of rules-based multilateral trade, people, companies, governments, entire systems that have won giant benefits. And those benefits are first difficult to remove. They impose huge costs if we try, but also they're very adaptive, and you see supply chains adapting in real time, whether it's to the US-China rivalry or to global supply chain resilience issues, the pandemic, Russia and Ukraine and the rest. But the second one is that it is the WTO and the rules-based, and those rules, the GATT and WTO system. Dr. Ngozi often notes that about 75% of world trade is conducted under those GATT basic multilateral rules, that basic framework. In the United States, about 60% or so of the welfare gains we see from trade came from the Uruguay Round Agreements Act, so our WTO membership. New research shows that outside of the United States, WTO and GATT rules are still dominant parts of, say, ag food supply chains, for example. And arguably, multilateralism is even more important today because of those global supply chains and just how diversified they are. But I think beyond that, we see that not everything in the world trading system is about the United States and China. There are, we've talked about, a lot of other countries. And here governments are continuing to show their support for the WTO system, whether it is through multilateral agreements, smaller, yes, but still happening, plurilateral agreements, dispute settlement. These things are still happening, and they're still happening here at the WTO. And so I think declaring the death of the WTO is not just premature, I think just pretty much misguided.
Okay, so we can work on it. Very good. It's a basis to work on. Rob, there's a lot of criticism that has come, in particular, out of the United States on the WTO. Some have said it has lost its way as an institution in its 30 years of existence. You need to go back to basics, do something else. What is your take? Has the WTO lost its way as an institution?
Is the mic working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. My sense is that the WTO is in the process of, to some extent, rebranding and retasking itself in light of the complex realities of geopolitics and geoeconomics today. There's a lot of merit to the rebranding. So what was the original brand? It's already been alluded to a couple of times. Negotiating big agreements with rules that are judicially enforced, and ultimately where compliance can be pressured through the imposition of sanctions. So what became apparent was that this model, which was in the service of what? So-called openness or liberalization, the ideology that Jason Furman lucidly and comprehensively articulated in the previous session. So we know what we're trying to do. We're trying to curb governments in order to make the world safe for market actors. And we know how we're going to do it, which is these big agreements with rules that are, quote unquote, enforceable. So one reason the model, I think has been not one for success going forward in the future is simply that the ideology has become doubtful and tarnished. The current leadership of the WTO, and I give the Director General a lot of credit for this, doesn't want to make the organization, let's say, a retirement home or assisted living facility for a defunct or tarnished or declining ideology. So one needs to find another way of looking at the fundamental mission of the organization. And I think what we're seeing now is an attempt to do that, a struggle to do that with concepts like inclusive trade, better trade for a better world. So if a variety of power dynamics and geopolitical realities plus the tarnishing of neoliberal ideology make the original brand not viable, well, let's use the institutional and human capital we have in the WTO to do a lot of things that will make trade improve the lives of people and make it possible for groups that have been marginalized or relatively disempowered in the trading system to take advantage of those opportunities. And I think it's not just a talk. There's a lot of walk as well. There's a whole range of initiatives, cotton, FIFA, what's going on with plastics, gender, and equity in trade, and more recently, engaging indigenous peoples. So all of this is, I think, excellent. And when we talk about institutional capital, the WTO has a lot of information about supply chains, about what's going on in the real world of trade. Information, as in this wonderful paper that I recommend to you by Martine Guzman and Joe Stiglitz, Post-Neoliberal Globalization, International Rules for Global Prosperity, as they say, is a global public good. And for people in the trading system who can't necessarily afford to buy state-of-the-art 3PL or 4PL, providing this information about trade regulations, restrictions, about how supply chains are shaking out, and providing it on accessible digital platforms transparently is a very positive contribution. It helps people who are smaller or more marginal players actually get a fair shake in trade. Similarly, customs facilitation, and there the message is not simply liberalizing or removing barriers. If you can get the border to work more efficiently, more effectively through harnessing technology, you can not only make good trade less transaction cost intensive, you can be more effective in stopping bad or dangerous trade as well. So it's a win-win from the point of view of different sets of values. Deliberation. There are more ways of dealing with spillovers and commons problems than negotiating big agreements of rules that are judicially enforced. Making the WTO more of a deliberative space where there's dialogue on issues like standards, for example. And dialogue can produce adjustments. It can produce superior understanding between countries that think initially, or regulators who think initially, that they're on very different wavelengths. And that's going on day by day. Now, are there any warning signals about this? It seems to me that there's one danger, that the rebranding can overcome the substantive retasking. And perhaps one needs to be a little less slick, fewer slogans, and also on deliberation to bring in even more voices, to not be uncomfortable with disagreement and conflict. And so, when one sees, prominently in this forum, which is a very exciting and diverse event, nevertheless, a lot of very high-level billing for people associated with that older ideology, one wonders how much, some people might wonder how much has changed in terms of outlook and openness to an approach that isn't dependent upon some of the dogmas and mythologies associated with neoliberalism. But overall, my sense is that things are moving in a very positive direction. And again, harnessing the institutional resources, the information, the data, using digital technologies well, can really produce results, not just a new brand for the WTO.
Okay, we'll get back to how to move forward in the second round. Federico, tell us a bit more about how your company is faced with all the changes that we've seen and already alluded to, from industrial policy to supply chains changing to new regulations coming in, etc. What's your experience with this?
So I would say that as a company that operates in some 80 countries and handles something like 11% of all global trade, we're acutely aware that there is a disparity sometimes in the perception of how business and governments, so the public and private sector, see not only the processes but the outcomes of globalization. But it is clear to us that without effective governance to enforce a rules-based order, we'll have tariffs, we'll have quotas, we'll have trade barriers, all of which can fluctuate quite unpredictably, as we have seen most recently, for example, with the EU and the US tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. We look at things, of course, not only through the lens of our own experience, but through the lens also of our customers' experience. And we see that increasingly then, this will lead to increasing costs and tensions for our customers as they seek certainty and a modicum, at least, of predictability within this world that is experiencing so many geopolitical shocks. And this impacts profitability, and it impacts also production volumes. Just to give you an example, one of the largest manufacturers of vehicles in the world, Toyota, experienced a decline in global production numbers in the 6-month period, month by month, between February and July. In China, a decline of about 6%. In Thailand, a decline of about 14%. And all of this also compounded by a decline of sales in both China and the United States, which are critical markets. So we see also that these trade tensions and these geopolitical shocks are leading to an increased fragmentation of supply chains, and are also impacting their ability, our customers' ability, to expand their market share compared to domestic manufacturers, which is, of course, the whole point of it for the people who are putting these barriers in place, without looking at what the unintended consequences are of these barriers. When we look at it regionally, for example, you look at the Caribbean region, which relies very heavily on imports to keep its economy actually going. And indeed, the World Bank has estimated that about 80 to 90% of all of their foodstuffs that are available in the Caribbean countries come from imports. And still you see that the disruption that lingered following the COVID-19 restricted global container capacities and diverted supply chains to higher capacity ports in North America. This prevented, for example, some of our customers from being able to deliver orders to its clients in places like the Dominican Republic, for example. And that company then very quickly had to pivot to a nearshoring model, then sourcing things from Peru, from Mexico, from all of these sorts of places, in order to be able still to carry out its business. So we see that actually a lessening of governance from the WTO impacts everything, not only the costs, but also the supply chains, market access, regulatory compliance, all of these sorts of things. But more importantly, they can really hinder the ability of the global system to generate inclusive outcomes for the more disadvantaged or challenged communities and countries, such as in the Caribbean, for example. An analysis from Oxford Economics, for example, and the ICC predicted a permanent loss of GDP of over 5% should the WTO not be able to carry out its mandate or be dissolved. So countries like those in the Caribbean, like those in the Pacific Islands, who currently don't enjoy high levels of integration into global supply chains and value chains, are really disadvantaged then by an erosion of the multilateral trading system, which lowers and also exports and heightens investor hesitancy, then also limiting the level of foreign direct investments into those countries that actually need it most. What we're also seeing too often is this weaponization of supply chains as the world faces really this deepening of fault lines and national geopolitical shocks. The situation in the Red Sea is an excellent example of this. You're hindering free access into the Suez Canal and therefore access to Europe, and you're forcing global supply chains to round the Cape of Good Hope, which massively increases the time of goods moving from something like 25 days to actually 60 days. So all of these things have a tremendous impact, not only how we do our business, but the movement of goods.
Thank you very much for drawing this picture of what's really going on the ground. Bright, obviously we see demand for more robust trade. We see demand for other issues related to trade to be taken into account. I think Rob mentioned those quite well. It seems to me that the organization is trying to work on both. Where are we right now in terms of the different files and that are being negotiated, discussed at the WTO? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jana. The first thing I want to speak to is the title of this particular session,
Okay.
which is says revolution or evolution. Let me simply say that revolution is not in the DNA of trade. So just to put it to one side. However, we believe in evolution, and evolution which is continuous and forward-moving all the time. I think you can have revolutionary impact. I think this is what all of the things you've heard in the last couple of days with respect to 1.5 billion people being moved out of poverty. That is revolutionary. And that has happened not because your action was revolutionary, but evolution. It took so many years to negotiate the terms and various agreements that led to that particular thing manifesting. So I just want to put that before I speak to your implied next point, which is about where are the files. MC13, you're referring to MC13 files. In my judgment anyway, MC13 was a success. And I say so because MC13 is being judged to some extent unfairly against MC12, which was the revolutionary MC, because we got things beyond what anybody expected. And because of that, people were looking at MC13 and saying, well, you only got a few of these items, not as many as MC12. So in a way, it was a victim, in a way, of the success of its predecessor. If you were to judge it against MC11, which is what I've spoken to some of our colleagues and some places I've interacted, you will say, oh, MC13 was a great success. So I think that particular point I want to put on the table. It is true, in fact, that we received, if you like, fewer successes in areas than we had hoped for. For example, the things done for the interests of developing countries, S&DT, things to do with LDC graduation and so on and so forth. All of these things were very important for LDCs who had waited for a very long time to get these things agreed. The next point I wish to just draw attention to is that the e-commerce moratorium, which clearly is very important to very many countries, is very important to small businesses that are operating in that space. To get it extended, I'm happy that Madame Marie Mengistu is here. The drama that went into getting that was huge. And I chalk that down to be indeed one of the big successes because it could easily have ended at Abu Dhabi, and that would have been a very difficult thing for the global trading system. So that was a success from MC13, extended, of course, for 2 years. And I'll come back to that in the next, as we look at the sunset clause that was built into that. We received 2 new members, Timor-Leste and Comoros. I mean, people don't rush to join a dying organization. They get away from it if they, as fast as they can. So this, again, was a big thing, and a lot of the fisheries progress made with ratification of the first fisheries agreement, those certainly were very refreshing to all of us. So the files are there, the files are moving, some faster than others. Now, of course, the investment facilitation agreement that was worked so diligently and hard on by so many people, we got, I mean, it's there, it's done, it's a done deal. We simply are looking to transcribe it into the rule book of the organization. And I think progress is still being made in the consultation on how to get it past the line in that regard. One final thing I want to mention in this regard is what you said about the dispute settlement system. You refer to it as a crown jewel. It is our crown jewel, and we love it. I want to say, however, that it is still shining, actually. It's simply, you need a bit of buffing it. And buffing it will not be that, you know, with members, they are working very hard. I know that because I interact with them, the chair of this, driving this effort. They're doing it. So the crown jewel is not gone away. And I'm going to give you some things to illustrate this particular thing. The first one is that when you talk of dispute settlement system here, I have to indicate clearly that members have brought 36 new cases to the WTO since 2019, 36. So that's not trivial. There are 6 active panels at the moment in operation, all working towards the, or if you like, in service of the dispute settlement system. So that in itself is a triumph. There are 10 ongoing bilateral consultations, 10 bilateral consultations among members or between pairs of members. Now, what this signals to you is that trade, you know, is moving. Of course, we don't sing our successes so much, as somebody told us yesterday, but these are things that are keeping the system moving along. There are currently, all the things I've described to you, not every panel outcome is appealed, as some people sometimes think that you just have it and it's appealed into the void. It's not the case. It's not the case. In 14 disputes since December 2019, parties did not even bother to appeal, which basically meant that they accepted the outcome of what was there. So I want to sort of pause it there for this first round, and to indicate that, yes, the system has it needs a bit of buffing, as I said. System needs a bit of, rejigging. You've heard of reglobalization. All of these are efforts to, I think, use the word that was used by a prof here, about reimagining, if you like, or rebranding the WTO as an organization. But the core of what we do still stays and stands. So the files are moving. Just a long way to answer a very short question.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. So that has set the scene. Let's try now to move forward. I mean, is all this satisfactory where we are? What should be done more? Let's start this conversation with you, Mari. I mean, revolution, evolution, what is it that really needs to change? I mean, we don't have that much time. Please keep it to what you think is the most important, because time flies, and hopefully we will want to open the floor, hopefully, to a question or two from the audience. Let's go to the point.
Well, I think we have to start with the context it's kind of following from yesterday's panel. You've got to take as given that the U.S. is not going to be, or the major powers are not going to be there to take the leadership role of the past. You will have continued U.S.-China tensions. You will have continued security, economic, technology nexus. You will see continuation of unilateral measures and industrial policy. That's a given. And guess what? The defragmentation that can happen and so on is going to hurt developing countries the most. So for us, then, therefore, in terms of the evolution, I would prioritize this codification or limiting principles of the invocation of the security exception for using restrictions.
That would
I
be
think,
revolutionary.
is that revolutionary? It's yes. Okay, it's revolutionary, and new areas like subsidies. I still think subsidies, because subsidies can only be negotiated multilaterally, and the increase of subsidies in the industrial policies that are being invoked by developed countries are actually hurting developing countries. And we, as was mentioned earlier this morning, developing countries do not have the fiscal space to do subsidies. So this is something that we also need to work on. And of course, I would still, even though we've buffing the dispute settlement, it's not robust as it should be if we want to address these unfair unilateral measures. So I would still push for that. Second, the negotiations need to be really continuing to balance development with liberalization, opening up with development concerns, whether it's facilitation, capacity building, and so on, because this is at the crux of what developing countries want. And there are still, I think, shortcomings in delivering on that. Third, I think monitoring and transparency, notification on trade measures and subsidies. That seems like an innocuous ask, but somehow we still haven't gotten over the line on that one. I know that's been on the table for some time. And I would say maybe let's focus one issue which we experienced recently in the pandemic and the food crisis on supply chain resilience. We got to make sure the principles that was agreed with G20 and WTO, which is if you were going to do emergency medical or food trade restrictions, it has to be measured, transparent, targeted, and temporary. Yeah? Those principles maybe can be more codified in the WTO. And finally, plurilaterals, which we talked about continuously. I think plurilaterals have a big chance to be continued. We have e-commerce services and investment facilitation, but how do they become WTO agreements, right? And I will come to the revolution part in a minute, but other areas of plurilaterals would be digital trade and AI, and I would say trade and climate, because that's where it belongs. The discussion on trade and climate needs to be multilaterally dealt with, otherwise developing countries don't get a seat at the table to ensure that it is not contingency protection, that we are agreeing on the standards, we are agreeing on a program of capacity building. So what's the revolution? My final point is on the revolution. 2 points. I know this is revolutionary. We are a member-based, WTO is a member-based, consensus-based organization. And it allows one vote, one member, one vote, which has been a great outcome. But it needs to be a responsible voice. And we need to think through how can we have breakthroughs to come up with constructive ways and creative principles to make the consensus work responsibly. Yeah. Yesterday I suggested an idea, but it was not an idea, it's an example of how ASEAN dealt with it. ASEAN was also consensus-based, but we came up with a -X principle in the sense that everybody follows the negotiations. If they're not ready to join, or if they have an issue they need to resolve, they can wait until they're ready to join. But, I know this is revolutionary. I'll just put that on the table. And the other one is, of course, the declaration of developing, and whether you're developed or developing. And if you're developing, there have been discussions over the years, different levels of development, different speeds of development can also be something that can be accommodated to have this more constructive and provide a way forward in a, constructive way, right? I call it constructive incrementalism. We go where we can, and hopefully with middle powers. That was my final point. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. Given that you have major powers not being able to lead, yesterday's discussion called for middle powers or coalitions of the willing on different issues to really continue the fight forward for ensuring that we have a multilateral trading system that is really beneficial, has been beneficial, and should be continue to be beneficial for us.
Thank you, Mary. That sets a blueprint and seems to me, as an outsider, that going to the heart really of the matter. Let's see if the members pick that up and the middle powers flex their muscles. Scott,
Yo.
do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I agree with a lot of what
Yeah.
Mari said, but I'll say, specifically with respect to the United States, quite frankly, if I had a way to break the fever that has kind of seized U.S. policymaking on trade, I'd be giving the keynote speech and not be just a panelist. The fact is that, right now I think we need to acknowledge that the United States is less interested in playing a leadership role, to put it very nicely. How does that matter for the WTO? Well, I think it first, again, going back to what I said in my opening, understanding that the baseline rules are still operating pretty well, and we should continue to embrace, support, and defend those rules. But of course, not everything's perfect, and I think it is important, as mentioned, that we need to admit that this approach to a single undertaking, consensus approach to these big deals like Uruguay and then Doha tried to be, is just not right for the moment. Instead, whether it is reevaluating how consensus works, or my preferred position is to embrace plurilaterals, as mentioned. Going back to the United States, I think there is a role to pressure the United States a bit in that on plurilaterals. If 120 member nations are signing a really good deal on digital trade, I can bet you that Congress and the White House and others are going to hear about it from U.S. tech companies and others that are left, on the sidelines of those things, or left looking out on the outside looking in. So, but more on other issues, whether it's environmental goods, services, I think there's a real role right now in particular for plurilaterals. And moving on without the United States wherever possible. And then finally, some of this is just simply waiting in time. I do think the fever in the United States will break eventually. There is, you can see it a bit, I think, already. We may have passed peak protectionism. Maybe in December we'll know more after a certain election in November. But that it will, I think, take some time. There's been declarations of the death of globalization and deglobalization since I started doing this more than 20 years ago, and I'm sure there'll be more in the future, and sometimes you just have to kind of wait it out.
Okay, Rob, what is missing in your views? What should be done? We set the scene. Maybe you don't agree with some of.
I was just going to make
Yeah.
a comment about the whole area of e-commerce digital.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of good substance in the draft plurilateral text on e-commerce and the investment facilitation agreement as well. But one of the difficulties in encompassing the WTO's contribution to these crucial dimensions of economic life in agreements negotiated over years and distilled into rules is that, the technologies change very fast. And for example, in the case of AI, we don't really even know how, we're even just starting to imagine how it will ultimately affect so many things, governance, legal liability, a whole range of issues. So if you spend years negotiating rules, the world will change while you're negotiating. And so we need other ways of thinking about the WTO's role in the global governance of these issues that are less rigid or susceptible to the problem of rapid change, which traditional multilateralism was not really, I think, designed for. Also, and I say this as the lawyer on the panel, one has to overcome the obsession with legalism. So take the investment facilitation agreement. Again, a lot of great content in it, but should one be obsessed with putting it in a rule book or making it binding and subject to dispute settlement? If you look at the content, it's really about the improvement of governance, about best practices, of transparency, regulatory rationality. These are things that can't really be effectively enforced through, dispute settlement, applying rules. They depend on capacity building. They depend on the willingness and understanding of states and public agencies to implement these governance improvements. So we could get very far, I think, in implementing these kinds of norms without necessarily making them into traditional binding rules enforceable in dispute settlement. And for example, one of the greatest things about the plurilateral draft e-commerce text is it seems to be giving strong support to moving to e-bills of lading. And that's where you can realize significant gains in reducing transaction costs. And it's a problem, even today, that most jurisdictions don't really accommodate, digitalized trade documentation. But we don't need a set of rules. We need to think about, the legal issues, insurance, liability, contractual structures that are necessary to think about to basically move the world towards digitalized trade documentation. But the good news is we don't need to be negotiating Uruguay round style agreements to start doing these things. We could start doing them now, even if, a lot of this material is just in draft or not yet binding in plurilateral instruments.
So that's a very interesting point. I mean, there is a paradox in having an investment facilitation agreement with very many soft provisions and then having them go to dispute settlement. I also wondered, how do you do that? But your point is taken of having something more living in terms of institution and change and agreements. Perhaps not making everything absolutely legally binding forever in some areas. It's very interesting. Federico, I mean, from your side, the business side, the operator side, what's the change you want to see?
I think within the private sector, we're very well aware of the challenges that the WTO faces, from structure, decision-making, governance, all of these sorts of things, dispute settlement. But let's take a step back just for a moment. I think that it was also clear to us that there were only three ways that this could go. Either business as usual, that means this uneasy and strained effort at facilitating and negotiations and mediating and doing these sorts of things, to continue, number two, to continue inserting itself and being influenced by growing rivalries, particularly between the two gorillas in the room, the United States and China, obviously not a sustainable thing long term. Or number three, to actually undergo serious reform. And I'd really like to take a moment to say that I applaud both the energy and the courage of Dr. Ngozi in embracing very much this latter part of saying, yes, I am prepared now to do what it takes to undergo this reform that the WTO seriously needs. I attended a session on reglobalization yesterday, and I think it was Professor Baldwin who mentioned that the WTO is not dying. It's evolving just as the world around it is evolving. And we very much see that as well. And I think, and I hope that we can all recognize and leverage fora such as this one to understand why the role of the WTO is absolutely vital if we are to keep the impetus of globalization with all of the positive arguments that were presented so cogently and eloquently by Professor Furman just a moment ago, and what our roles are in supporting this evolution or revolution for that matter. I think from our perspective, it's clear to us that given the opportunity, the private sector will help and support strengthening the system and the refreshing and the reinvigorating a rules-based order. We think it's absolutely critical. But we do feel that this order needs to be sufficiently flexible to remain adaptable and be able to build resiliency into the system. I mean, let's face it, trade is not the same as it was 30 years ago. Countries don't negotiate in the same manner as they did 3 decades ago. And for that matter, the people negotiating are not the same and don't have the same things at stake as they did 3 decades ago. Just look at the growing share of the developing world in terms of GDP. Countries like India, for example. So I think we do need to adapt our negotiation for countries with different economic models on the one hand, but also, let's face it, to some extent, political philosophies on the other, so that we can enable them to trade with each other and accept their strategic autonomy and also their national priorities. That must be critical. And I would suggest that in a world of growing geopolitical contestation, this is even more important. Again, given the opportunity, the private sector really wants to be considered a partner and not a spectator in the whole process. Not just in the implementation of global standards, which of course is very important, but also in helping shape these regulatory environments within which we operate day in and day out. We can and want to support the WTO in making these changes to build a system that's going to be fit for the future. But we see also that very often, and I mentioned this at the dinner yesterday, you'll remember, we talk about resiliency, but we don't do enough to ensure that systems are resilient. Rebecca Greenspan, for example, mentioned digitalization yesterday at our dinner. And we very much believe that this sits at the heart of a practical and solutions-based approach. For example, at the last MC13, we launched a policy booklet on showing that digital solutions are absolutely critical for this resilient system moving forward. I mean, we've seen that it could cut global trade costs by as much as 14% and boost global trade by as much as $1 trillion. These are big numbers. These are very big numbers. However, we see that even today, less than half of all countries actually and governments have fully implemented cross-border paperless trade. And where it is happening, we see that it has a great positive impact. I mentioned yesterday, for example, the single window solution system in the Dominican Republic, which cut inspection time by a third. And let's face it, time is money. We always talk about that, right? It generated an additional 52 million in revenue from customs as a result of this. So we have to embrace this digitalization, and we cannot let paralysis from analysis impede the growth and the implementation of these sorts of initiatives. Beyond digitalization, one of the things that we are seeing is, for example, the diversification in trade routes. We don't think that these trade routes are anathema to each other or that they're exclusive. Green policies, for example. So in the session that I attended yesterday, also Annabel Gonzalez said something that stayed with me. She said that we need to update the WTO rulebook to reflect a new reality. And I think that certainly on behalf of the private sector, I would say that we all need to play a role in helping update this rulebook.
Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that. Right. As a secretariat, you're not allowed to have very strong opinions, but you know what's happening, you know what's possible, and you know the files. You're in charge of making this happen. So what it is really, in your view, what the members need to do to get to this new level, you know, to have these new agreements in place, to move forward maybe to new discussions, some of the topics that were already put forward by Mari Pangestu. So what do you tell members now?
Well, thank you very much, especially for saying that I'm not allowed to say certain things. So that is clearly you set the
what I'm
rules,
being
so
told all the time. I'm not supposed.
well, no, you
as
did
a
well.
secretary.
Well, you're right. It's the courage to say it that I'm praising you for. I have to say that taking things forward, as you've indicated, they're stemming from work that we are doing that is continuous, is evolving all the time. So it's not that it's sort of stuck or whatever. And members, I have to say that I commend them because they undertook certain retreats just before we went on the summer break to try to improve the way that they themselves make decisions. And that, I think, demonstrates to everybody the commitment that they have towards moving us forward with the work they are doing. I have to say that some of the things we're trying to move forward by way of priority, we are doing so because they are time-bound. They are time-bound. The first one, let me just start with the dispute settlement system, which you mentioned at the beginning. The instruction is that we should try to reach an agreement by the end of 2024. This is directly from MC 13. So, to restoring the DSS system to a functioning role, obviously we have to then discuss what the content, but that instruction, and end of 2024 is not very far from now. So that's one thing that I would say, and I'm not recommending to members to move forward. They are recommending it to themselves. I'm just bringing it out so it's clear that this is one of the areas that we are all jointly working on. The Secretariat in supporting the members. So this is the first one. For e-commerce, I think you probably will remember that it was agreed subject to a clause. I want to read it, maybe not read it exact word for word, but we need to find a solution by MC 14 or on the 31st of March, or by the 31st of March, 2026, whichever is earlier. What it means is that we need to work hard to finish this. We don't want it to lapse, really. So we really need to make sure that between now and 31st of March 2026, this issue is resolved, one way or the other. And I think, let me say one way, really, rather than one way or the other. In other words, we want to resolve it positively such that it no longer becomes it's no longer an issue that we are sort of splitting hairs about. So that's the other one. Yeah. The next one is the fishery subsidy. Fish 2 is critical. People sometimes don't understand, or maybe not understand. They don't think about it along those lines. Fisheries 2, the subsidies there, is very critical because it says if a comprehensive agreement is not reached on Fish 2, 4 years after entry into force of Fish 1, the entire thing collapses. Sometimes when we discuss, people leave this aspect. So a lot is riding on Fish 2. It needs to be done. It's been done. I'm not sort of saying. Actually, we were very, very close to reaching an agreement in Abu Dhabi. Everybody pitched in. well, we came very close, including our hosts. I can see the ambassador here. We were very, very close, and since coming back, the work has continued under the leadership of the chair. So I am optimistic that this particular one, especially with the implications, that if you end up not being able to do it or finish it, it affects what you already worked so hard to achieve in the prior one. So that's another aspect that, by way of priority. Now, I should mention that apart from the sunset clauses, we have a lot of other things. Agriculture, I didn't talk about in my first intervention. Not because it's not important, but agriculture is in a special category. It's been negotiated forever. Well, maybe not forever, but for a very long time. What this means, if you build in the issue of food security and the concerns in that area, then you can actually see the necessity that even though it's not time-bound written on paper, it is time-bound for humanity. And I think it's important that we make progress in this area. And members are working extremely hard. I know the chair, in fact, we had a member, Brazil, because of their desire to see success in this, they initiated something which was meant to be an input into the main discussion. So all of these things need to be moved forward, and I really believe the good news, of course, is that the gap between getting that agreement and the little push that we still need to, it's not very great. So that gives me optimism. I will just give you 2 more points before I hand over the mic to you. The first one is the lessons. First of all, WTO is still extremely valuable to members. This is what I myself have learned from listening to members after meeting in this room and we can't agree on some things. And you talk to them privately and they say to you, yes, they really want to get something done. So I think that point, because this is the only place where you can negotiate with those you don't agree with. People you agree with, you don't need to negotiate too hard with them. But this is the place, this room you are looking at here, may look very ordinary, but this is where it happens. Of course, with the subsidiary organs of the body. So that is the first lesson. Second one is that we are facing things that are increasingly more complex, beyond what we did in the 20th century. You have climate change is new, you have digital trade and things related to that, which has been talked about variously. And you have the push or the drive or the cry for more inclusiveness that was not quite there in the last century. That is growing louder and louder. What I'm saying here is that we need a bit more flexibility among the membership to give and take, to be ready to look at the bigger picture in each of the steps in the negotiations. And the retreat I referred to earlier was actually one of those efforts made by members, initiated by them, to try to really see how we can move things forward more quickly. And I really commend them for that. The final one is that element of consensus. Consensus, this is how this place is built. That is the architecture of the place. If it's not working as well as perhaps we thought it would, we've already been given the example of ASEAN as probably something to look at. But I think one member gave us a term here of responsible consensus. I believe all of this play into that desire to move forward and to get results. And I really am optimistic that this can be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much for ending on this optimistic note. I mean, it does make you realize how much the membership has moved, that it has injected a sense of urgency by setting deadlines. We will see. Bringing the system on the brink is also an interesting method of advancing. It might work, it might not work. We started a few minutes late. I don't want to run too late, but I do want to give one person in the audience a chance to ask one question, not to make a statement, to ask one question to anyone. There is a hand raised right there in the back, in that corner. Up to you, please state your name and your affiliation, and please ask a question. for statements, speakers are there, and later for at lunch, coffee, and in the atrium. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, we hear you.
Namaste. I am Janardhan Baral. I am from Nepal. As mentioned by Mary, some of the countries are dissatisfied because trade liberalization has not benefited all nations equally. Those with strong trade capacity have gained significantly, while poorer countries, such as Nepal, lacking the ability to participate fully and fairly in global trade, have been left behind. The WTO claims to provide a level playing field for all countries, but this has not been reflected in reality. I would like to ask to the all panelists that what are your thoughts on it? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a very interesting question because that comes also from a landlocked country, which has been one of the subjects here. Who wants to start? I think everyone or a few panelists will want to say something. Rob.
Well, I think this just absolutely supports the logic of this new focus on inclusive trade, the rebranding that I spoke about, that it's time to place a great deal of emphasis on making it possible for, all countries and all people to to benefit from these opportunities, and so that definitely has to be the way forward as a matter of equity, and also as a matter of the WTO as an organization of aspirationally universal membership is the place to really move forward on this.
Thank you very much. Mari?
I've always believed that with trade, you can't just focus on the liberalization. You've got to have liberalization, facilitation, and capacity building and technical cooperation, or whatever you call it. And they have to come together. And this is part of the, I think, long discussion, how to have coherence, not just from WTO, but with multilateral development banks, with UNCTAD, and so on. How can you deliver to countries so that they can better integrate with the world trade? So I think for countries like Nepal, you've got to be able to prioritize what needs to be done before you can be ready to open up. And there has to be a process that helps these countries to be able to deal with the challenges that they have. And some can be short-term, some can be long-term, but what is important is to learn from what other countries have gone through and learn also how to have a coherent capacity building. And this is something that I think the WTO, it's not just up to the WTO, I guess that's what I wanted to say. It has to be up to WTO with its coherent partners. I forget what the word was. I think there was what is it called? Coherent integration. There was a process that we tried to create way back when, where you are involving all the development partners to be able to deliver the needed capacity building.
Yeah, so maybe I'll leave the last words to you then, Bright, on this issue, because we've touched upon several things. There is a new strategy by the Secretariat that was released yesterday that focuses precisely on that, on partnering with other institutions to give a more holistic service, if you want, to member countries who have different needs. Trade can't be taken, just treated alone, and the rest, well, we'll see how we deal with. I understand there was at some point a landlocked country conversation. Whatever you want to respond to this gentleman from Nepal.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's a very important question. One of the things we've been pushing and we've been doing in WTO here has been the concept of reglobalization, which is meant to, as much as possible, to benefit countries that did not enjoy the first wave of the globalization. And that includes getting supply chains to these places, away from not just the big and traditional ones, but spreading it across. The other thing that I want to mention is that it is, in fact, in the enlightened self-interest of the rich countries and everybody else to get these countries to enjoy better benefits from global trade. The reason being, first of all, as an economist, you want to have a bigger aggregate demand possibility from these countries. Because the richer they are, the more they can import from you going forward, the more they can do business with you. The second, which is more sociological, is this migration thing that is going on. We need to solve the problem, the economic problem, help them solve the problems of economic difficulties in their countries so that people can remain in their countries. I don't think they want to come to Europe. It's cold, these places. They want to stay home if they can get a job in their place. I want to just put that on the table. The other one, of course, is a challenge to members, including Nepal or countries, that we need to help them to make the internal reforms that will attract investment into their countries. Because if it's not very attractive, it's very difficult to bring people who are going to invest. The final one is a small one, which is something I call beneficiation. The new minerals, the ones, rare earth, all of these things that are currently in vogue, we need to encourage businesses to invest in processing facilities where these raw materials are found. Not just go and extract them and take them to Europe or China or America or wherever because you need to be able to create jobs and respect the environmental integrity of those places where these things are extracted as part and parcel of a re-globalized, imagined global system that Prof referred to earlier on. So that's where I want to leave this. But thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much. We'll leave the conversation here. I could go on for hours. It is a huge topic, but time is up now. I think we did get an overview of all the main issues. Some might get away with a sense of where things could go, hopefully well. So please give a big round of applause to all the speakers and the panelists, and see you soon.